पूछ ले
किसका फोन है तेरा? ये ना देखता हूँ, डिस्टर्ब होगा ऐसे बोल दे।
कैसा गया पीवाईसी का एग्जाम? चला तेरे कौन से दोस्त ने हेल्प करी? अरे हमारे गाइस ऑडिबल है ना सब कुछ?
हाँ
yes.
ऑडिबल।
चलो परफेक्ट। आज बीपी कराएं क्या? घर जा
रुकना आ रही।
अलग नहीं लगा, थोड़ा थोड़ा हो रहा है। नहीं थोड़ा थोड़ा कंप्लीट हो रही है, ऐसा दिखता है। आज ही आया मेरी दवाई में काम हो गया एग्जैक्टली
मैंने छोड़ा
भाई ये नहीं करता चला एकदम मतलब मेरे को यही सेंटेंस बोलेगा हो जाएगा क्यों सोना है बड़े दिनों बाद।
मैं पकड़ के लाई हूँ उसे।
नहीं मैं आ ही रहा था ये
आ ही रहा था मैं लेजिट से पकड़ के लाई हूँ जबरदस्ती।
तुम लोग वर्कशॉप की रिकॉर्डिंग में भी हो अभी जैसे तूने नहीं ब्रो तुझे बस ऐसा लग रहा है मैंने बाल कटे
ये जाकर सच्चे नॉवेल
नहीं भाई किसने कटवाया किसने
सर्वज्ञ भाई समझ ही नहीं आ रहा सर्वज्ञ है
स्क्रीन शेयरिंग उस पे
ये क्या चीज चल रहा
Or should I just like put it up on their picture?
वो भी कर सकते हो
तू डायरी लिख रहा है डायरी यार नहीं हो गया ओ भाई तूने इतनी डिबेट करी है तेरी आज क्या वो डायरी अलग से दिस इज सरप्राइजिंग एक्चुअली सरप्राइजिंग
ऐसे जज मत मारो यार आना रहा
और क्या
हो सकता है कभी किसी का मन हो कभी किसी का नहीं हो ऐसे तो
काफी बच्चे आज हैव रिटर्न टुडे
है ना महीने के आपके वो पे नए नए नाम देख रहे हैं
Yeah, I should just begin now.
Yeah,
Yeah, I should delete it.
वो ऐसा है
तो share कर दे, screen share कर दे.
This is a personal diary. Fani, be in your limits. अच्छा माइक कौन है क्या
चलो चलो फाइन
Should share it to Eduardo.
वहाँ रखिए उस साइड के पीछे उधर एक शायद पीछे में रखिए
पीपल इन द टीम्स कॉल बस एक बार बता दो इफ यू कैन सी द स्क्रीन चलो ठीक है परफेक्ट ऑडिबल एंड विजिबल सब कुछ अभी
Can you guys see me?
हेलो गाइस रिस्पॉन्ड कर दो अभी को
Can you?
Yeah, you're audible.
ओके
Yeah, audible.
I'm audible. Am I visible?
चलो कोई ऐसी पूरी स्लाइड को दो फिंगर से स्क्रॉल करिए ये पीडीएफ खुला है
कैसे
ऐसे
ओके नीचे की
Let's begin. Yes. Cool. Hi everyone. My name is Avi. In case most of you may know, in case some of you may know, I am in third year. What else? I think that's sufficient as of now. So, cool. So with that being like my basic introduction, I mean, so this workshop is about web speeches, particularly in like obligatory format. But like this can be extended to like a generalized broad sense as well. In case like you want to use this in like the British Parliament meeting format, that also works. But like few things here and there, right? So I think there's some issue like यहाँ पे वो gap है. If you want to just fill that up. आ जाओ इधर आ जाओ सारी कुछ से concentrate
चला लो
Cool. Okay, let's begin. So, actually, before I begin, like there's some disclaimers which need to be given. That like I do not claim that this workshop is like in its complete essence is extremely holistic. In the sense that it encompasses everything that there exists possibly in this world for web speeches particularly. I do not claim that like these these strategies that I'm going to talk about in this particular workshop will 100% work for you as well. These are some things that have worked for me and for a lot of people who have debated historically for them as well. They should ideally work for you as well. In case they do not, you may try to devise your own strategy as well. But in most cases, they do work. And this is not like comprehensive by any standard. I have tried to make it as comprehensive as possible, but there's a very high chance that there's something that I may have missed as well.
So I'll just have your views.
Just like send me on the link.
डेफ अच्छा पे
तेरे को भी मिल रहा है
Sorry for the soft delay. I'm just like joining this thing, and then we can like reconnect.
पानी
ये पानी चाहिए ना लाइट चाहिए ऐसे नहीं होता है इस लाइफ में स्ट्रगल करना पड़ता है
पानी चाहिए या फिर क्या चाहिए अनलिमिटेड है वहाँ
Folks online, can you guys just like let me know if you can hear me better and are my slides visible? Projector भी नहीं है, वो क्या करते हैं? नहीं, हाँ वो तो नहीं. Sorry,
It's visible and you're audible also.
my slides are visible, right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, but sure then. So having given the disclaimer, let's just begin then. What am I going to cover in this presentation? I'm going in this particular workshop, so to speak, right? I'm going to talk about what are the goals of a general whip speech. For that, I'll talk to you about how do you rebuild, rebut, frame, weigh, and compare from whip speech. How do you work strategically from whip? How do you prepare for your speech before and after, like during the debate? And finally, how do you structure like the entire speech, right? So with these being like just like content like index, let's start with the first one. Just basic introduction. What is a whip speech? This is not extremely trivial. Rather, I've tried to like talk about certain different things. These are not generally talked about like while talking about whip speeches, right? I think basic idea sabko hoga. I'm assuming, right? Everyone knows what basic whip speech is. Yes? No? Yes. Okay. So what do we do in a whip speech? We decide on how to make the best use of each marginal unit of time and energy to win the debate, right? I mean, which is like literally, so whip speeches are effectively the last constructive speeches, as you all know. So you've been given 7 minutes, time is limited, your capacity is also limited. So how do you this is your last chance literally to like give out whatever you have constructively from your end. In earlier speeches, you need to gamble a little bit, but by whips, you know what is the best decision in order to win the debate, right? By that I mean, like in like your first speeches, PM, LO, and your deputy speeches as well, you don't really know like how the debate is going to pan out. However, in the whip speeches, you effectively know what's like what the debate has been up until now, because effectively in whip speeches, there's not something that any of the speakers can add in terms of the constructive sense, right? I think this is something that you guys know already. That you can you can sure give like new examples, new rebuttals, all of that is something there. But you cannot add like anything constructive, anything analytical, anything mechanistic or stakeholder analysis. All of that is something you cannot do. I'll come to that as well, but just like a brief intro to that. Then do not fall into the trap of doing the same thing in every debate. So this is not like the strategy that I'm going to talk about. It's not something that you can let's say umbrella, like you can't really like make an umbrella use of it. Rather, it's something that you have to customize your whip strategy depending on like each and every debate. So you customize that to your according use. And then every stage, you have to ask yourself what is the most useful way of my time as well, right? So I think in most cases it has happened with me as well, wherein initially I was like extremely fixated only onto like one sort of structure and strategy in terms of like doing my whip speeches. But over time, I realized that that's not something the most wise thing to do. So like you completely or on the onset of the debate, you keep on questioning yourself what is the best like usage of your time as well. So crucially, like what do you want to do in your whip speech then? That you want to give the judges what they really want in terms of like analyzing which side as well. what are the goals to then achieve in the whip speech, right? You have to, one, rebuild the case. Second, give rebuttals, especially against like the other case, obviously. Like the third one being like you have to provide some kind of framing, characterizations and examples. Like I said, framing and characterizations is extremely hazy line. You have to traverse that extremely carefully. That is generally prohibited to not really go into details of like completely new characterization and framing. That is generally disallowed. However, if that's something the need of your debate is, up to you. So examples, new examples are something which are more than like encouraged. So that's something that is valuable. Then what you need, this is like the crux of a whip speech, right? Which is you have to compare arguments and the alternative worlds as well. Then you have to weigh in with like which is the most important actor, which is the stakeholder analysis. In essence, you have to also like weigh what are the impacts, metrics, and what are the different trade-offs that are there in the entire debate, right? Finally, if there are like some like ambiguities in the entire debate, try to talk about some clarification of the arguments and explanation like that is there in your other like teammates' speech as well, right? Okay, so what are the things that we should not do ideally in a whip speech? Mechanistic analysis, again, like explaining why something occurs. This is something which is expected that you should have already done in your previous, like in your first two speeches. Second, stakeholder analysis or incentives. This is ideally like supposed to be done in the first speech itself. Third thing, like justifying principles and like explaining why a principle is important. Let's say, for example, like this house will ban prostitution. In that particular in that particular debate, like let's say from the government side, if you or maybe from the opposition side, you run a principle wherein you say that you would not ban or like prostitution because that's something like that actually is the agency of that particular individual to decide for themselves whether they want to engage in that particular like activity or not, right? So this principle, the example of this principle should already come, and the mechanistic analysis and like why is it important, etc., should have already been done in like the first two speeches, which is like the leader of opposition and the deputy leader of opposition speeches, so to speak, right? Then like what's the last thing that you should not do in a web speech is like do not give new substantive explanations. This is, I think this suffices in terms of you don't like really go into the areas of like talking about a lot of different new arguments, rather just like build upon and rebuild upon like things that has already been said in the debate. Okay, so let's talk about rebuilding the case now. 1 second. Okay, so what are the general rules? You don't really give the same analysis because it becomes redundant. That is nothing but obvious. Then you don't like you don't understand your like you don't like undersell your own arguments, which is to say that like let's say that there's some argument while your prep time you don't 100% agree with that particular case line, your argument like with that particular argument, you don't try to actively undersell it in the sense that you don't really say like this is something that I don't really agree with. Rather if that's something you don't wholeheartedly believe in, try to like not really go like traverse in that particular domain by saying like that's not something that we agree with, or like don't like try to knife. This is called knifing. This is again a debate jargon. You don't really try to knife yourself in the whip speech, or you don't try to dump. Like what is a whip dump? That's something that I'll like discuss towards the end. In case I forget, please remind me to do that. However, let's move forward towards like talking about like how do you rebuild arguments, right? Okay. So we first address the response from the other side, which is like by taking the most charitable reading of their argument possible. This is especially important because the judges may read this into their response and they may even have another shot at rebuttal. So you need to ensure that you rebuild deals with the best possible version of the response. I hope that like that is self-explanatory, but I'll still just like explain for the sake of explanation, which is that you try to rebut and like when you rebut, you don't really like let's say assume that the judges have already understood completely what they have said. Rather, you can also like in case that's something ambiguous to you, you try to like let's say give it out to the judges that this is something what they said and this is exactly the rebuttal that I'm going to give to this particular like let's say the line of argumentation that side opposition had given, right? So that's something that you address the response, and this is how you rebuild on your like previous argumentation. What is the second thing then? You rebut the rebuttal. What is this? which is that you frame it out in the debate. For example, let's say by showing that the response could only be true in a specific circumstances, which aren't really true in this particular case, right? So you talk about like the exclusivity of their particular arguments or their rebuttals, even for that matter. So this is how you like, let's say, go about finding exclusivity in the arguments. Specifically, let's say if I talk about any particular example wherein like any argument or any example that they give or maybe the line of reasoning that they give is only specifically used or maybe applicable for that particular instance, you have to like, let's say, show as to how this is generalized and this is not in a very specific instance. For example, there's some like, let's say, political motion, right? If side one of the sides give a reasoning which is only applicable to like, let's say, one political party, then you can call them out like, let's say, that this is not really true for like most majority of the politicians. This is just like one trivial example, so that like things are better in place, right? Like what is the last thing? How do you rebuild it? Then you run through like the chain of logic, which is extremely important. That you again briefly afterwards, run to the chain of logic again briefly, demonstrating that the whole argument now stands again, and the other side have failed to adequately deal with it. Even if they have, this is a strategic thing that you try to do in general, that you tell them that they haven't sufficiently dealt with the entirety of your argument, because that's practically not possible insofar as this is a good debate, and you have like majority of arguments to be discussed and dealt with, and you don't really like, let's say, the opposite side cannot possibly like, let's say, engage with the entirety of your argument, right? So if you deem that is important, you can call the other side out by calling them that this is not something that they've adequately dealt with, and that's something that you tell the judges. And like I said, that in the whip speeches, what you essentially need to do is like give a biased oral adjudication of sorts, right? In order to convince the judges that your side has effectively won. Okay. Yes. Uh-huh. So this is not a good response, response. We can and we just get away with it. You have to get further analyze it and why is it not a good. No. You obviously analyze it. Why is it not a good enough response? Because any assertion that you make within like your speech and within the debate is not something that is valued. You tell them as to why whatever response that they gave, where does it lack? It's like exactly like that's something like the crux of the entire thing. Otherwise, it does not really hold ground. I hope that makes sense. Yes. Cool. Okay. So how do you rebut from whip? Okay. So what are different levels of rebuttal? Like I already talked about. That rebut, like I already talked about, whip speeches are effectively the last constructive speeches of the entire debate, right? So you have already seen how the debate has went. Then what you need to then do is that you have to provide, like, let's say, one, either you tell them why the premise is wrong, which is like I think your reps and like other people who have taken the workshops previously have told you what premise is. I just like briefly tell how do you go on and build arguments. You have a basic premise, you build upon that in order to develop a particular argument, and then you finally conclude it by giving some evidence. That evidence could be in terms of like, let's say, examples or some like proper structured reasoning, right? So that's like the evidence part of it. Okay, so that's something. Yes.
We accept one or two of this strong points and try to mitigate that and tell that why our stands, but like, do we just say that this point of their stands at any point in the website, like this point of their stands, but it is applicable to a very small section of stakeholders, and trying to mitigate and like explicitly telling that this stand and mitigating this.
Sure. Yeah. So if you try and act extremely smart by saying ki acha like unhone jo bhi bola is nothing but bullshit, you are like making yourself come across as a stupid person who has not understood like the other person's argument, right? So you have to give them the due benefit in terms of like if they have already explained something, you have to give them the due credit and then further move on in sense as to how can I actually win and go forward from here, right? I hope that makes sense. So yes.
How biased should we be like in the whip speech? Because how much should we give, like there's a line, right? Between bias and the review. So can I please like give example like what is the line that we should
see, so what I'm saying is that let's say let's say we are government, opposition has made certain X argument. If you try to manipulate it and say that X is only applicable like in certain situations, let's say that is a special case that they've already done. You take them at their best, like you being the most charitable to them. And then you say that one, how this is only applicable in this particular circumstance. You take them at their best. Say that is the majority. If it applies in let's say majority instances, you say okay, this does not apply in these particular instances. However, it does apply in these majority instances. So even if let's say we don't really traverse into not being applicable in the lesser let's say the minority part of it, let's focus on the majority, right? So if you focus on the majority, they have already let's say successfully explained, and you've conceded the ground that they have explained it, right? If you concede there that they've explained it, then how do you go forward and rebut the case from there on? I hope that makes sense, right? So these are different situations wherein you have to identify as to what are the responses that you have to make to one particular argument that you deem as the most important one, or in the entire debate for that matter, right? I hope that makes sense to your question and your. Okay, then what do you then need to do in the level of rebuttal is that you have to develop some sort of even if scenarios as well. I think this is this goes without saying, but this is extremely important that you have to develop. This is exactly what I'm saying. Explaining to Ishan that you have to let's say develop even if responses, which is that even if it does not apply in the minority circumstance, it applies in the majority circumstance. So if it applies in the majority circumstance, this is how we are going to tackle this particular response. Right? Okay. Then you don't really need to provide the full analysis if the rebuttal has already been made. Like I said, time is limited, and the capacity to which you can let's say talk in your particular 7 minutes, that is again also limited. What you then need to do is if you think that it has already been established, don't really go into the details of it. Just say that this is where it has been defeated already, and that's why and that's why I don't really need to talk a lot on that, right? So that's something that you can already concede. And hence it is extremely important for you to understand note taking as well, right? So note taking is also something that I'm going to talk further in this particular workshop. But just be assured that you know wherein one particular argument has already been defeated. If you keep on dragging that same thing over and over again, that becomes redundant to a point where it does not hold let's say it does not add any value to what you're saying. Okay. So you don't really just argue the point to a wash. What does this mean? That you over explain and over analyze things in terms of let's say them becoming actively worse for the other side goal as well. For example, let's say if you crucially relate things back to what they have what you wanted to achieve, either the point fails to engage with the higher stakes or your case directly engages with the argument. What does this mean? So in general, what is a wash? Wash is something wherein you are not able to weigh it very properly. There is one particular argument which is being made. Side opposition has already made it. You on let's say or in the government whip try to let's say negate that particular argument by saying certain things. Then you come to a point wherein you have not shown the judge as to why your side has won or either their side has won, right? So that becomes a wash wherein we don't know probably the impacts and the analysis that has come from either side is almost equal, right? So that is when weighing comes into the picture, right? Then how do you rebut from whip? Again, that you break down the mechanisms or the principles or the logic of the other side. If you show how the other side's benefits or harms cannot come to pass, you can either remove those impacts from the entire debate or take them from your side, right? And then finally, don't just rebut the other side. Make sure that you fit the rebuttal into the wider debate. How does mitigating, this is where whip becomes extremely important. How does mitigating the other side, defeating their material, etc., weigh against the arguments that you brought, right? So this is literally what whip speeches need to do. However, in a lot of circumstances that you will find whip speakers not doing it. However, this is extremely important, right? That you need to weigh to the other side. You only give rebuttals, then your whip speech is no different from the other two constructive speeches, right? Which is the first speech and the second deputy speeches. And hence you need to make your whip speech identifiable exclusively by let's say telling as to how those rebuttals that you have made or maybe the entire reasoning or rebuilding that you've done, how that very well fits into the picture of the entire debate, particularly in your clash. I mean, particularly in your case line, either be it from side government or side opposition. Okay. So what are the different frames and characterizations that you then need to do? So one, value neutral statements which clarify the debate. Okay, so for example, what will happen? Who is involved and how will they act? This is the frame and characterization that is something this is expected that to have been done already In case, like I already said, this is something generally not preferred. If in case it has not been done, you do it strategically in a manner, but not like really portraying it as this is a characterization of the new framing that you are doing. Rather, you try to portray this like as like, let's say, rebuilding of your own case that has been done already, right? So what is a trade-off? Trade-off is something that is exclusively to like with speeches. In likely to occur, and why do people like think now, and how sorry, what do people think now, and how will that change? That's something that you talk about in your with speech. Okay. So if that's something that you already know, how do you work out from there? First thing, do you know what is like the true characterization? It's not enough to just know. You need to be able to explain like the example to judges who may be skeptical even if your knowledge is correct. For example, I think this example has been given multiple times. I'll give it at the cost of repeating myself. I will give that again. For example, like the motion is that this house will shoot Gandhi. In that particular example, if you don't give out like the clear, like I think shooting, everyone knows what shooting is, right? But what are the different types of shooting? Which shooting explicitly that we're talking about in this particular debate is something that you have to talk about. Like if that has not been done already, I think the debate would be a mess. But like at the cost of like, I'm assuming the debate is like still well enough. You still go ahead and tell like what do you mean by shooting? If that still is an ambiguous activity up until your particular speech, right? What is the second thing? Are there any similar cases like that you do know of which may be applicable in here? What are like let's say the key differences between your example and like the case at hand, and like you work out your example. Let's say this is like you trying to draw certain analogies, and this is where like the analogy part becomes really important, right? So in a lot of cases, you try to give a lot of analogies. How do those analogies look like? You probably think, so how do you give analogies? So let's say, for example, you have certain like case in mind, and you try to link it with a different scenario. Let's say, for example, let me think of one. Meanwhile, what you were saying something. Yes.
Clarification can come in good speeches also.
Not characterization exactly, clarification. Yes. Okay. But yeah, I was giving you an example. Let's say, for example, one political party has done something, or maybe like let's say in religious debates, let's say like certain things are applicable to one particular religion. You try and extend that to another religion that is at hand in that particular debate. How do you draw analogies? It is very difficult to draw analogies in between two different religions. For example, if let's say it is Hinduism, or if it is Abrahamic religions, I think trying to draw analogies in between Abrahamic religions is rather a little simple for you, right? So, for example, you try to draw, like let's say, an analogy between Islam and Christianity, or Judaism for that matter. Then you try to exactly show this is why certain things happen in, so let's say the case in hand that you have is that of Christianity. You try to show that this is the case in hand in Islam, and this is how Islam and Christianity are like, let's say, being logically linked to each other, and hence there is a very like high probable chances that this has already happened in like Islam, and hence it can also happen in Christianity as well, and it is bad in general for the stakeholders that are there. I hope that makes sense, right? So this is how you draw analogies, wherein you have to very clearly show, let's say, for example, how do you draw analogies between two different religions? For example, you say like Islam and Christianity are very similar to each other because they have derived their roots from like, let's say, similar ancestors, which is like both of them are Abrahamic religions. Second, they also trace their roots to like one particular place. Like let's say it may be contested to a lot to different degrees, but like that's something that we sort of agree on, that like that's something Jerusalem is where they have been effectively, let's say, originated. Also, that's something that you can talk about, probably that because like what were the situations in which both the religions have originated, etc., right? So this is how you draw analogies as to this is something that has already happened in this particular situation, because this situation and the case in hand is very similar, and hence that situation is very probable to happen in this scenario as well, and hence this situation happening in like my case is going to lead to bad or negative consequences. Right? This is how you draw analogies. And if you, in case you don't really draw this logical link in terms of like telling me as to why Christianity and Islam are very similar to each other, your analogy is not going to work. Very simple, it is not going to work. Even if you try to say that it is extremely important, it's very similar, and then you try to do it later on, it does not work. You literally have to tell the judges as to why there is there exists an like let's say logical link in like let's say the examples that you're trying to draw. Okay. Then what is the third thing? is there a general trade-off that you can apply to in the particular debate? If you don't know the specifics, you can also simplify the characterizations into a basic trade-off or avoid characterization altogether by trying to abstract the debate. But you need to be able to explain why the abstraction applies only to this case. This may be a little bit like confusing to you. In case it like I to make it like a little more simpler, I'll tell you what this is, right? I think what I've tried to like encapsulate in here is that, like, let's say, for example, there's some trade-off that you know exist. For example, let's say this house will restrict drinking alcohol only to, let's say, Delhi NCR. This is like, let's say, this is like the like a very trivial example of motion. What is the trade-off in here? The trade-off is like, let's say, more people are not able to, like, let's say, get what they want, which is like their individual right, versus the trade-off being that the Delhi government or maybe the NCR government is not able to, like, let's say, churn out their economy is better, because a large part of, like, let's say, the economy is heavily reliant on, like, let's say, consumption and like the selling of like liquor in like the Delhi NCR region, right? Let's say this is the kind of trade-off that we are trying to look in here, right? So which, like, let's say, which idea or let's say which right is more important, whether it is the economical reasons, like, let's say, whether the government should ban it, or like, let's say, it's the agency-based reasons of that particular individual who wants to consume it is now being actively, like, let's say, discouraged from being consumed it, right? So that being like the basic trade-off, if you're able to identify the trade-off, in most cases, I think they should be very trivial and understandable to you. In case they are not, you try to, like, let's say, go deep into it and understand, like, what are, like, let's say, the reasons, and then you try to chalk out the clashes that has already happened, like, in the first two speeches, so to speak. Cool. So what's the fourth thing? You generally try to use your common sense to determine what will occur, how the actors. This is notice. This is something that I've like written, wherein this is something to be done when the debate has not already happened, right? After like the debate has happened, you literally know like what are the clashes, what are the trade-offs in the debate. This is something that you need to think while like thinking of your speech before the debate. Okay. So you try to work out a logical characterization, but be ready to be flexible for another team team is able to, like, let's say, the challenge your characterization that you have already given. Cool. Before we move on, any questions? No? Okay. So how do you find the comparative then? So this is very similar to, like, let's say, finding the clashes, and in general in a web speech, it is extremely important. What is a comparative analysis? You need to try to compare the two sides of, like, the argument and the motion, obviously. You have to determine the relative benefits and flaws of each side and discuss them relative to one another. Then you have to use this use of comparative language in general facilitates like, let's say, the kind of comparative that you're trying to draw in your speech particularly. Let's say, for example, we try. Yes. Let's say, for example, how do you how judges do OAs can be a good example, right? And hence, like, let's say, people who judge often are encouraged. I mean, this is why you are encouraged to judge. So much and so that like that actually helps you in your web speeches as well. That is like extremely, like, let's say, very directly focused, because web speeches are nothing but like sort of a biased adjudication. However, judging in general also helps you to, like, let's say, make things into perspective better. And that's how you, like, let's say, make taking notes, etc., and whatnot, right? So judging in general helps like that. But coming back to web speeches, how judges do OAs can be a good example. First to assess what it looks like, then to compare. That you need, like, both the individual characteristics of the word and the comparison between those words as well. For example, this house believes that universities should establish dangerous spaces, right? So what does this mean? So in your web speech, don't just, like, ask whether it is a good when universities do this, but also try to compare it to what happens when universities don't do it. Also, like, ask what they would be doing instead, and compare it to, like, that as well, right? So this is something that I've already talked to you about in terms of, like, trying to derive the even if scenarios as well, and trying to create a lot of them for that matter. So the note is to link it to the change in the motion, the level of specificity or the generality that is implied. What does that mean? That means that, let's say, if you are trying to, like, let's say, talk in this particular example, let's say that this house believes that universities should establish dangerous spaces. Let's say, for example, if I talk to you about what these dangerous spaces are, and if I don't like explain, like explicitly tell you how is that related to, like, let's say what has already been discussed in like the previous two, like previous four speeches, I should say rather. In that, like what has happened in the previous four speeches, they are not able to compare it directly, right? So we are talking about some different, like let's say characterization or like let's say the idea of dangerous spaces, and that is extremely different from what has already been discussed in those four speeches. Okay. Then what you then need to do is that you need to be making comparison on the specific thing that is going to change. This dynamic, obviously, and like not like something more or less in general. Cool. Any questions on, like, let's say finding the comparative? If you guys have. Everyone has understood how do you find the comparative? Yes. Okay. Let's move forward then. How do you weigh arguments? Weighing arguments and like finding comparatives is, I think, like everything is important in general in speeches, but I think like weighing in arguments is something that exclusively comes only in whip speeches. Finding the comparative can probably come. Doing comparative analysis can probably come in like the first four speeches as well. But like weighing arguments is very specific to whip speeches, right? So why? So how do you weigh arguments? So let's say the first thing to be talked about in here is that why is your argument most important? These are like the host of, like, let's say cases that you can probably use. One or more of them can apply to your particular instance. I just like read through them. Your argument applies to all cases or most cases in general. Second is that your argument applies to most important group or actor, which is like the stakeholder in general. Your argument applies to the group which is more directly, specifically, or the most heavily affected. Then you can also talk about that your argument has the highest impact as to like how does it have the highest impact in terms of, like, let's say the pragmatics or the consequential part of your particular argument. Your argument then, like, what's the next thing is that your argument always happen or is the most certain. This is when you try to target the other person by saying that target, not person, but like their argument. So like your argument always happens or is the most certain, right? Like the other person says, you can call them out by saying that their argument only occurs in a specific situation and is not, like, let's say, true for the entirety of like the debate spectrum. Rather, your argument is something, this is specifically useful in case of a wash, right? So what is a wash? Like I already said, when you don't understand which side has effectively won the debate, then you need to do like the weighing of arguments, right? So if you do the weighing of arguments and then you tell that the argument that you have used is like applicable in most circumstances. However, the argument, or let's say the impacts are impacts that are coming from both your arguments are almost symmetrical, almost equal. Then weighing of arguments becomes important, wherein you show that your argument applies to most number of people, wherein their argument does not apply to like most instances, right? Then your argument achieves benefits more universally than other arguments. Then you also talk about that it provides a necessary mechanism to allow like the most important or the urgent harm to be dealt with, or it focuses on the short or long term, like the optics of the argument that you are trying to make, which is particularly important when there is a wash, right? So, and hence, if there is a wash, finding and weighing arguments, it is exclusively important. In case there is not a wash, weighing in arguments in general helps a lot. So what do you then need to explain as to why do you weigh, as to how do you weigh is valid there, right? These are the four mechanisms as to how do you do this. One, what is your framework for assessing the practical or moral weight of the argument? Second, why is it important to emphasize one kind of impact over another? Third, compare arguments. Don't just assess them in a vacuum. Obviously, you need to compare. You need to compare arguments, taking appropriate context in that is there in the debate in mind. And finally, you have to weigh in arguments, but also weigh team's contribution as a whole as well. Cool. Any questions? Yes.
If I say that my argument applies to most amount of stakeholders, but they say that their argument applies to the most important stakeholders,
Sure.
then how do I counter that weighing?
Sure. I think you can't. I think, let's say your government whip and you say that it applies to most, majority of stakeholders. Then let's say it is inherently more valuable if their argument is actually trying to focus or being directed towards the most important stakeholder. then I think if you have already done this in the government whip, you don't really have a lot of time except for like the reply gov speech.
Preempting, like I already know that this should be.
Sure. Then you obviously can't use this way.
Then I can't use like the most number of stakeholders.
Yes, because that is that is inherently like lesser valuable, right? Because I mean, there's not some there isn't something that has like extremely universal. Like let's say it is actually extremely heavily case dependent, right? So, but in this particular case, like you're saying, if there are instances wherein people end up saying that their argument like affects more important stakeholder, then it is something that you should not engage in weighing.
There is some motion of transgender, and the other team is saying that what about the people's perception of transgender? And when we saying about the transgender itself.
Sure.
So of course, the transgender becomes the most important stakeholder because they are oppressed for a long amount of time.
No. That is like the assumption that you've taken. It heavily relies on the kind of motion it is. For example, the motion is that this house believes that this house believes that LGBTQI plus communities should be like there should be a reservation for LGBTQI plus communities, right? So if that is like the motion in hand, then obviously transgender people are like if not the most important, one of the most important stakeholders. Other people who are actively competing for like let's say like there's one seat that has all the if the motion passes, the seat will only be reserved for transgender people. So then you have to identify through your speeches and through your the case line as well as to how another person who was equally, I mean, who was previously equally, let's say, having a chance to, or maybe to actually gain that particular seat, has now been structurally disincentivized, or like, let's say, cannot, let's say, get that particular seat because it has already been reserved. So that person who could have probably gotten that seat is now being, like, let's say, disincentivized from getting that seat. So not only the transgender, rather like let's say that particular person who could have gotten the seat is also an important stakeholder in here.
Basically, depends on the case.
Depends on the case. How like depend one depends on the motion. Second, how do you interpret the motion? And third, how do you after how you have interpreted it, how do you argue it? Right. So it's like extremely case dependent.
The sides it depends more on the PS or the DPM and the LO and the DA how they are built in cases. Like it can't come and like give these analysis because comparing
I think
this like in this specific case like reservation of LGBT the most important is the transgenders and the community and the majority is the say the people which are not from that community. So does it depend that how the post speeches are worked out?
Sure, it does, right? That's why I said, how do you
Because what I'm saying is that if the government whip comes in and says that we are getting the most important stakeholder, but if the opposition has not even talked about like the majority of the people, they have only bashed the community and not talked about the majority, the opposition we can just start this coming and say we are getting the majority, right?
No, you can still say, right? Because in that particular debate, you can call the other, the other team out by saying that they have not adequately engaged with us. One, second, because they have not, let's say, insufficiently engaged with us, and hence we deserve this right to actually dictate this to you in terms of how this weighing of this particular argument should happen. Right? Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, so that's just calling out the opposition that the side has not even.
Correct, and that is how you convince like the judge that because these guys have insufficiently dealt with that particular community, which we deem as important, and like just saying that we deem as important is not sufficient, because you need to tell them why do you think that the community is also important. Once that has already been established, then it is like then it was like let's say their burden, which is the opposition team's burden, to engage with you. In case they haven't done already, then you win. I mean, like then you win in this particular argument. Right? Any other questions? So let's say for example, you don't consider or take into account the fact that transgender community, like if there's something that has something happened very recently, let's say, or is it happening in a particular environment? Let's say, for example, if I talk to you about in United States. So if you like, let's say, this all believes that transgender communities should be provide reservation in United States. So if you don't talk to me about that, you try to generalize in United States. Got that right? So if you don't really like, let's say, talk about why it is extremely like why this motion is extremely important in United States, and you talk about random things, or like you talking about random reservation that should be given to transgender communities in, let's say, the other parts of the world, then it is not really important, right? So let's say you have to have what is the context of this debate, and then you need to like, let's say, weigh the arguments in general. Yes. Okay. Any other questions? Moving forward, what are the clarifications that could be made then, right? So when you might need to clarify part of your team's case, what do? One, when your case is like, when do you actually do this? So one, when your case is overly complicated and it's clear or possible that the judges have not understood it. Second, when the other side has mischaracterized your case, this is particularly important in the case of definition challenge. Rahul was rather extremely fond of doing definition challenges. But but going back to that, why it has like mischaracterized your case, and why like when where they did not respond to the case, and you feel it's like necessary to restate it to demonstrate their lack of response. Third, when you want to strategically shift the case you ran in case without compromising the integrity of the argument. Finally, it is also just generally useful to clarify exactly what your team brought, separate from any other clashes in general. I think this was extremely self-explanatory. Do you need and like any clarification on this particular part? Yes. Yeah, I mean, so for example, I think there is one clash, let's say clash A is happening. In general, it is difficult to identify different things. Let's say, for example, there's some motion. Two important clashes in the debate are which side makes the world better. That is one clash. The second side is, like the second clash is which side, or maybe where, like in which side is the stakeholder better off. These are two important clashes. Okay. So if if you're not able to, let's say, distinguish like very clearly, like where is the world better off, where is your stakeholder better off, it is generally a good idea to do that in your particular speech, because in general, whip speeches are meant to provide a lot of clarity to the judges and not really overly complicate things that has already happened like in the above four speeches. Yes. Okay. So how to clarify without conceding ground? Okay. So the same principles apply as when you are rebuilding the case, which were one, that you need to flag up the part of the case which wasn't clear. Second, you need to address how the other side has characterized the argument, their misunderstanding in case. You also need to provide a lot of clarity on how the argument should actually be viewed in the debate. And fourth, that you restate the claim or the chain of logic that you have identified in the prep time, also while you are like, let's say, debating as well, right? So that's something also important. Okay, so you don't concede the argument. That was two. This is important. How do you do this? You don't really go ahead and say that, acha, this argument is extremely complicated. Probably you didn't really get that, right? You try to strategically and covertly try to like push this thing that other side has probably not understood it, and hence they are not able to engage with it, and hence I'm able to provide you clarity in here. This could be one way of doing it, right? So you don't really concede the argument was too complicated or that you are shifting the burden of the case. Rather, you are clarifying the deal to the other side's misunderstanding and potentially to give them a chance to respond. Or, yes, or you are dealing with the incorrect characterization, right? Does that make sense? Okay. You were rebuttals then. So if we go ahead and like use this is exercise only for you. I am not going to go like into extreme details of this particular exercise. I will just read it out for you in case you have some issues. This is something that you can do to every, like, let's say, motion, right? So in case you want to do that, you can do this. I just read it out for you once. So for a given motion, take a list of 5 general arguments which could be made by one side. Select 3 of the 5 arguments and explain why the argument is wrong. Obviously, in the best possible form. So you don't really try to act very smart in terms of saying, Acha, like this is not like rather you trying to act smart. This is rather you trying to act stupid by not really like, let's say, agreeing to what literally they said. You try to manipulate it and say, Acha, no, you bol hi nahi paya the, and that's something that's not a good thing, right? So in this particular stage, you're trying to practicing the rebuttal skill as if you are a web speaker for the other side of the debate from like the one making the arguments, obviously. Then from the remaining two arguments, from the remaining two arguments, select. So from the remaining two arguments, select one and explain why it is most important to the other side. This is where it can be used in terms of like the British parliamentary scheme of things as well, and hence why the terminology is OG, OO, CO, CG. Then you try and compare an answer to others in like the training exercises, and in case there are some like help, that is something that is needed, always try to reach out to some other person who has already done it. In case they haven't, try to give them that argument and try to engage with them, like let's say be it your reps, conveners, or someone else, right? Okay. So this is where burden throwing becomes important. Does anyone has any like let's say doubts up until now?
If it is required, if it is necessarily required to rebut what the DLO said.
Yeah, matlab, see, so what you are effectively trying to do in this particular scenario is that you are trying to rebut like what has already been said, right? Let's say by let's say the virtue of you saying new new analysis, I presume that like the line of argumentation should remain same, right? It should not be completely novel that has not been said already by your first two speakers, right? So if you try to like change that completely, that counts as like a new analysis or like let's say a completely new characterization. That is something that is not allowed. That also is contingent on like the ability of your judge to understand whether you've done it or not, right? That's also something that it depends on. However, in most cases, I think if you try to like run on the like similar line of argumentation that has already been used, and then you try to revert it via that, I think that's completely fine. Any other questions? No? Okay. So how do you throw burdens then? So this is how you set strategic burdens and not really very evident burdens, or maybe like very evident trade-offs in general, right? So what do? So at the end of the debate, you are uniquely positioned to establish like the burdens for both the sides, so that when judges go back through their notes, they evaluate each and every team's material in terms of like let's say the burden that you are going to set, because you as whip speakers command this response on the judges like let's say mental state, that since you are let's say the last constructive speech, you have a lot of liberty and authority for let's say you identifying some strategic burdens that you have identified and like the other team has not fulfilled, right? So you try to throw those burdens on them and say that these are the burdens that they should have fulfilled ideally and they have not, and hence they lose this debate, right? Okay, so how do you set the burdens that seem fair and intuitive? Like this is like the just basic definition of what these burdens can look like. Drawing on the wording of the motion or common or simple to grasp intuitions, so that the burdens seem inherent to the debate rather than like unfairly constructed to the advantage of the other team. Then you also set burdens which your team has won on. This is also extremely important, right? So if you try and like let's say try to discuss burdens that you think are very fair and square, and that the other team has engaged on, and you have also engaged on, effectively you try to focus and like give extreme emphasis on the burdens that your team has specifically won on, right? So that's something that you generally try to do, and like by which you show that why you are particularly strong or relevant. Ideally, to seek to find a theoretical space where the debate is hard to contest and then intuitively favors your side, right? So this comes a lot via practice. You need to try to like listen to a lot of debates, and that is how judging helps, wherein you are able to. One second. In case you are able to find out how the teams have argued for themselves, and then you try to identify what were the burdens for government, what were the burdens for opposition, and that's how you like come to know better in terms of like identifying those burdens and then like strategically throwing them on the other team. Sure.
PM में you directly challenging the other person to actually करना है.
हाँ.
And with मतलब if you don't really address as the offside, what is that the PM, and instead make up your new what is it? Then you put this. That like
Yeah.
But specifically PM is what is it?
Matlab, in case the other side is accusing you of doing something, in case you think that could be a potential BT later on for the judge, try to clarify it as much as possible insofar as the judge does not feel that you have not adequately engaged with the other side. Once you think that you have sort of adequately engaged with it, not at the cost of actively harming your case as well, to try to maintain let's say a subtle ground in here by showing that you have engaged with them while at the same time not damaging your case to a great extent. That is that is something that you do in the PF and LO speeches. Okay. For particularly the whip speeches, you obviously can identify new burdens which are which are strategic in terms of let's say which have not been identified already, and you could also use this particular strategy that I showed you in here. Let's say by if there's some wording of the motion, I think in majority instances, a lot of teams completely forget completely forget to actually list down what their burdens are. So in case that you have already thrown that particular burden, the other team has not sufficiently engaged with it, you bring that up in the your whip speech as well. Additionally, you can talk about some new burdens as well, and then show as to why the other team has lost. Yes? Okay. Any questions? Okay then. So through this, we are coming towards so the strategy part of whip speech is already over now, almost. This is mostly on the note-taking part of it, which is how do you frame your whip speeches, how do you structure them, and how do you take notes? Because note-taking is extremely essential, not just in let's say whip speeches or judges. For judges, it's the paramount importance, but for the whip speakers as well. And for the other speakers as well in general. But I think whip speakers and judges have the let's say paramount importance of let's say understanding how notes should be taken. Okay, so everyone has different needs when it comes to taking notes. Do what works for you. For example, a lot of people take notes these days on let's say laptop or iPad or something like that. That's also completely fine if that works for you. Most people, I mean, for me, I try to take it because I think that's easier for me. I try to take it via pen paper. That's something that is up to you. That's one thing. But completely up to you. How do you want to take notes? In general, try to make them extremely holistic. That's something that I'm going to talk about in here. What is the checklist and how to what you may want to be noting down. Okay, so there are 5 things. First one being the arguments raised by the other team, the logical links, and any subpoints. Also the responses from the other sides, burdens, justifications, weighing metrics. Okay. Second, exactly what your teammates have said in the case. Even if you think this is not exactly what they have said in that particular speeches, you think that is important in terms of helping your case, go ahead and claim that this is something that they have said already. If they are even near and square to it, not really, let's say, barging out into completely new territories, try to restrict yourself to let's say similar line of argumentation only, right? Then how do you intend to lay out the whip speech? This is extremely important, and this counts in the structure as well. When you tell the judge as to how your whip speech is going to look like. Also, what are you going to say? For example, what the other speaker is trying to say and going to say, because that really helps you take the notes very extremely effectively, and make a checklist of all the things that they have probably said or not, and you can probably call them out later on as well. So what are the key points of clash that this particular have said, and you are taking notes for that, right? So this is from a third party perspective. This is not you doing it actively for let's say yourself or the other person. Cool. Okay. So what is thematic note taking? This is something that I try to do generally. I think, I mean, I do both. I can tell you how both is important. So in general, thematic note taking is let's say there is some clash, I explained the clash, that which trade-off or maybe which side is better for the entire world. Second, which side is the most important for the stakeholder that we are talking about, right? So let's say if you are doing that particular clash in here, what you can do is first write on one page. Okay, so how do you take notes? Let's say this is something that I'm talking for, like, let's say people who take notes via pen paper. I can't really talk, like, I think probably you can do similarly, people who take notes digitally. I can talk about like pen paper based notes. So what I generally do is that you have 3 pieces of paper. Yes. So in the first piece of paper, you try, like, just like how you like take notes for judges. Like, let's say you divide the page into 2 sides. One is clear, the other one is yellow or whatever. Then you try to take their notes. Then you try to track their speeches. In the other, like, let's say piece of paper that we have, to try and write themes. Right. Let's say, for example, you've written theme at which side is like the best effective for the most people of the world. Second, you write which side is best effective for the most like important stakeholder, right? So this is how you make themes in general while you are still taking notes for their particular like, let's say, tracking their particular speech as well, right? That's how you could like do both. I don't think it is like extremely difficult. In most scenarios, you are able to do it. Okay. So rather than noting each team's contributions separately as they occur, which we were doing in the previous thing, you can sort notes by theme, which is especially useful if you plan to by theme or points of clash. You also try to list new areas of the debate as they arise. Then note what each team is saying under each, like, let's say, under each, allowing you to refer back where the clash is on and each area and where your partner's case fits like well into like the case issue that we are talking about in here, right? So this is like the first thematic note taking. Also, like, let's say, tracking the debate like via speeches as well. Okay. So how do you prepare your speeches? I think this is something very self-explanatory. I just read it out. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer. So what do you do before the debate? You try to work out what the debate will come down to. This is something what you do preemptively. Will it be proving a particular point or efficacy, morality, or impact? Will it be won by effectively characterizing or framing the debate? Second, decide on what is the most likely case will be and work through arguments backwards and from there, so that you and your partner both know where the case is likely to be, like, with minimal communication. Also, prepare notes for the most important pieces of analysis or framing that you may need to use in the whip in general, right? What do you do during the debate? Obviously, you pay attention and like take notes very efficaciously. Second, you keep track of which arguments have been responded on both sides. Also, you try to communicate within your partner as well, and don't give them the information that they don't need. This is extremely important. A lot of times, you think this is extremely important thing, and then you try to burden your partner by saying a lot of different things that is literally, you think probably that is important, but if you think that is going to negatively affect your partner's speech, try to avoid as much as possible, right? That's something that is that you should not do. Okay. How do you structure your speech? Structuring a whip speech in general can be in a lot of different ways. Like I said, you can talk to me, talk to the judges in terms of different themes, or you can also talk about different stakeholders, etc., etc. So what will the structure of your whip speech depend on? One, what do you need to contribute in the debate in order to win? Second, what did the debate look like? And third, like the goal that you have should always be to select the structure which it will make that will make it clearest that your team has won the debate. Let's say, for example, you think let's say thematic let's say structuring of speech is extremely important, but that is something that is not the need of the hour. Arush, हीरे भाई. ठीक है. So that's something that you guys do in general, that it's not like you think like thematic, like doing thematic is extremely important, but like let's say the debate is going to traverse in a direction wherein judges have not understood what is the most important argument that you're trying to make. And if that misses the theme, like if that argument misses the themes, then it is not useful, right? So if you try to let's say go on to things that have already been said that the judges are already convinced of, and then you try to do it over and over again, that just becomes redundant and does not add a lot of value. Okay, so structuring a whip speech under time limitations is something. This is how you do. This is the hardest part of structure, which will always be dealing with limited time. You also have the default option in your mind or how you will structure your whip speech ahead of time. This is something that you can do in like your prep time as well, or you can do during the debate as well, right? So yeah, so that you never go up like to speak without a plan. In general, it's always advisable. Take some time, let's say take a minute at max, because obviously the debate has to start. In externals, you can't really keep on taking, let's say, 5 minutes like you take in internals before starting your speech. You have to immediately start your speech, and hence it is extremely advisable that you plan and structure speech well in advance before your turn comes, right? That should happen. Even like starting from the your prep time should also continue during the debate is progressing. Okay, so to remain flexible and take time before the speech, before your speech, to make a decision about the structure. Cool. So by this, we've come to the end of this particular workshop. What have we discussed? Just like summarizing it, key points that you need to keep in mind. Use your speech to prioritize what you need to do to win the debate. Second, rebuild the case, rebut the other side, weigh in arguments, and frame why do you win the debate. Third, structure your whip speech to take advantage of how the debate has played out and remain extremely flexible. Not that you thought like one structure is going to, like I say, work in an umbrella of cases wherein one structure has worked for one debate is going to necessarily work for the other. No, right? So